We're at 481 Laurel Avenue in St. Paul, Minnesota. In 1896, we think on the second floor of this brownstone, the Fitzgerald family welcomed its newest member. They named him F. Scott, after a kind of distant cousin who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. This, of course, is the birthhouse of F. Scott Fitzgerald, one of the great American authors of the 20th century, maybe one of the most famous people to come from St. Paul, Minnesota. We're going to learn more about him on this episode as we talk about popular culture and history. This house was bought in 1975 and turned into a set of condos, and the owner of the second floor kind of became an F. Scott Fitzgerald buff in the process, and this has become a historic site then in St. Paul. We were just talking to someone who lives downstairs, and they get buses of school children coming by in the spring. We're going to take you on kind of a walking tour of F. Scott Fitzgerald St. Paul, going to 3 or 4 other sites. This one was actually a pretty small part of his life. His family moved when he was just 2 years old and moved out east to Buffalo, New York, and briefly Syracuse, New York, before coming back to St. Paul when he was a young boy. So we'll pick up the story there. Let's, though, start a conversation about history and popular culture as it shows up in everything from literature to film to maybe even video games. So as you think about an 18-year-old who arrives on a college campus and is starting to take history classes, they've already encountered history at they've taken some high school history classes. Where else have they encountered history where they might not even think about it so much? You know, it wasn't in a textbook. It wasn't in 50 minutes in a classroom. In popular culture, museums, like where do you see history showing up in American culture outside of academic history?
Well, I teach history of the American West, and so this is a class in which we quickly discover how much they've learned about the history of the American West, but maybe they've learned it a little wrong because most of what they've learned has been John Wayne. And I love John Wayne, and I love Stagecoach and millions of others of his films, but I think that's one place where we realize that, you know, there's this sort of idea that they have about the American West and its history that comes from these films that were romanticizing something that maybe had some rootedness in history, but is actually a pretty far cry from the reality of most people. And so a lot of what we have to do in that class then is talk about where does the myth in these movies come from, because there is some reason for why the myth exists, but then look at how the history is different from the myth and the ways in which maybe they should rethink their sort of view of the American West and maybe watch further, you know, American West movies in particular more critically.
You know, I think I'm always of two minds about this. You know, in one way, popular culture, it teaches us and it misteaches us. So I think about this with like a World War II class that I teach, where students come in, they've never fought. You know, I mean, once in a while I might get someone who's been in the military, but for the most part, they haven't fought in a war. They certainly haven't fought in World War II, and yet they probably have some sense that I know what that was like, right? Because I've watched, you know, Band of Brothers or Saving Private Ryan, or I think we think of them as fairly naturalistic, or I've played Call of Duty, and I've actually inhabited the role of someone in, you know, Carentan or something. And part of what we're doing is unlearning some of the assumptions. And so that, you know, it's kind of a useful, teachable moment. At the same time, if I wanted to be more generous, charitable, I'd say, you know, part of history is cultivating skills of imagination. You know,
that's
we've
true.
got, I mean, I say it all the time to students, they probably heard an intro to history, we've got fragmentary evidence, we're not recovering all of it, we'll never know like this complete three-dimensional, full-color picture, and so partly we're filling in the space with our imagination. Maybe there are ways that forms like film and TV and even video games help teach us some imaginative faculties. Is that, it might be too wishful thinking?
I mean, in the American West class, I mean, they want to go and experience this place, and that's great. Like, if it gets them out of, you know, Minnesota and their own sort of comfort zone, that's great, and to explore it imaginatively is a starting point, at least.
It becomes a gateway, which I think is useful and helpful. And so I think of the number of adults that I talk to, older adults in Sunday school contexts and things like that, who, you know, they've come to sort of a love of history later in life. And it's interesting the number of stories where the thing that sparked their interest typically, as Anne-Marie said, was fabricated, and you know, and then that leads them to, you know, they're intrigued by whatever that film is or whatever that movie might be or that program on the History Channel. That brings them in. But then why I think that I can't be so dismissive of that is because once sort of learning the truth, if we will, once kind of studying more, being more self-reflective, being self-critical, certainly in the case of what Anne-Marie teaches, they tend to not abandon it, though. Mm-hmm. You know, they stay. So I think that it's still a really useful. I'm not particularly dismissive of things from popular history because I feel like they often become a gateway to get people to come in, and the interest remains. It's just that we have often a lot of clearing up to do and de-romanticizing.
Right, and I would say this, that, you know, there's a lot of ways in which popular writers, you know, they seem to have this quest to make the past more interesting by fictionalizing things, but in my experience of writing history, it's actually so weird and fantastic all by itself that I don't feel the need myself to fictionalize, because I mean, there's the saying, right, that truth is stranger than fiction, and that's often the case when I'm doing history. But I don't mind if people use the fiction as a way in.
Yeah, no, but I think I agree with that the issue is not so much. I also don't like the fictionalizing. It's more, can your focus be on accessibility instead of fictionalizing? Right. So can you find a way to make more accessible? And I think that students are really intrigued by sort of the obscure and the minute and the simple everyday types of things. Right. And I think that I know you and I both, and certainly Chris to you as well. I'm just speaking specifically to some of the courses that we teach. When you're doing women's history, when you're doing the history of minority groups, you have to sort of break out of the box, and you have to be able to look for the types of artifacts and other sorts of evidence that, you know, to be able to find the stories that aren't sort of being told in that broader culture. Thank you.
When I was a junior, instead of studying abroad for a semester, I applied to a program called the Oregon Extension. And what the Oregon Extension is it's a semester that you spend in the sort of mountains of southern Oregon, living up at an old converted logging camp. And you go up the mountain for a semester. You don't have a cell phone. You don't have really barely internet, no TV, radio, anything like that. And you go up in the mountains and you, with a group of 30 other students and 4 professors, and you read a lot of books. And you're all kind of reading the same stuff, challenging books. So history, literature, philosophy, kind of political theory, things like that, environmental ethics, things, those types of things. You read really intensely. You have, pretty intense conversations because you're in this community, this small community of people who are all reading the same things. It's just a powerful experience because it allows you to slow life down, to really kind of focus on your thoughts, focus on the thoughts of other people, and really start to answer some questions about, kind of really some of life's big questions. One of the sort of framing books that the Oregon Extension has used since its beginning is Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. So that's one of the things that I read when I was there, and that's a book that asks basically every big life question you can ask. These 4 or 5 characters who are all kind of circling around these questions, and it was really one of the most powerful academic experiences of my life because I was really looking for something that was intense, something where it was going to be academically really rigorous and serious. And I think it was a great training for working with students, not just in terms of what you do in the classroom, but working with students as they're going through wrestling with life's big questions as well.
Where you sleep all day, where they hung the Turk that invented work in the Big Rock Candy Mountain.
We're at the next stop in our walking tour of F. Scott Fitzgerald St. Paul. This is 25 Northdale. Right now it's a professional office building, but in 1908 this was the home of what's now St. Paul Academy, an elite private school in St. Paul. That year, Fitzgerald's family moved back from Buffalo, New York, and F. Scott Fitzgerald enrolled at St. Paul Academy. See a little statue of Fitzgerald as a schoolboy. He attended St. Paul Academy from 1908 to 1911. The school magazine marked him as someone who would probably control the school or else be poisoned, according to legend. In 1909, he published his first story in Now and Then, the school magazine. He was a pretty small kid, but he also tried to play football, and that became a theme in his first novel, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Okay, let's move now to an interview with another of our Bethel History Department alumni.
I am a Bethel graduate, 1988.
I'm a 1999 Bethel grad.
I'm a teacher at Minnehaha Academy.
I am the pastor of worship and adult ministries here at Church of the Cross.
Mutuality editor and publications coordinator.
I work as an attorney in the business and corporate practice.
English Language Institute, China, in China.
Library director at the College of St. Scholastica.
I'm a history professor at Bethel University.
I was a history major.
I was a Bethel history major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
History major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
My name is Michael Bumann. I currently work for ELIC, English Language Institute, China, in China, and I was a history major. For me, the draw for Bethel was a school that was smaller, a little more intimate. I didn't think I wanted that at first, but it was very appealing. And the combination between music and sports. I talked to Coach Jay, I talked to Dr. Port, the choir director, and somehow they worked out a deal where they could share time. And that was, boy, at any other school I can't even imagine that happening. The choir director and the football coach like actually knowing each other and actually getting along is pretty cool. And so, yeah, I think the opportunity to kind of do a little more was very appealing. The honest answer is that I took a poli-sci class and got a B in it and was upset. And I didn't, and so I was like, I don't want to do that. And I took a criminal justice class and I didn't like it. And so I kind of took a step back and said, what do I love to read about? And history was the very first thing that came to mind, and it was an easy switch. And I never looked back after that first semester. I think of a lot of things come to mind, but Ruben Rivera's class on Christianity in America was a highlight. And the simple fact that he and I were able to connect outside of the classroom as well. We ended up having lunch most Fridays for about a year and a half in my junior and senior year. And that was really critical for me, not only academically, but also personally in terms of growth. I read a lot of books and talked through a lot of things that I wouldn't have read about or talked through if I wouldn't have had that relationship. So my connection to the professors in the department, both during school and now since graduating, are probably the thing that really lasts in my mind the longest. China was the 1-year adventure that turned into a much longer adventure. When I was getting ready to graduate, I knew I wanted to teach, but I wasn't an education major, and so teaching overseas was a really healthy option. I was looking at a few different places, but China in the end became very clearly the best choice, and working with ELIC was great because a lot of support, working on teams, working in universities, which I wanted to do, and not high schools or middle schools. And so that's how I ended up there. Over the course of the years, I've done a lot of different things with ELIC, but now, starting my 8th year in country, I'm going to be the assistant city director in Changchun, a city in the northeast. So basically doing admin and team leading the team leaders of the 5 teaching teams we have in the city. So really investing in those team leaders and pushing them to grow in all walks of life, academically, spiritually, relationally, and yeah, it's something I'm really excited about. I'll teach on the side a little bit as well. So studying history in a small college in Minnesota, how does that prepare you for living in another culture? I think what I had, and one of the reasons I wanted to move overseas in general, was I feel like the Bethel history major gave me a lot of tools to examine the world around me, to go out and find the books about this place, go out and ask the questions that need to be asked, and wait patiently for an answer. think that's something that history teaches you, is that history takes patience, and people take patience. And so working in another culture and learning about another culture everything is new, everything is different, and you have to have tools to process that. And I think the Bethel History major gave me those tools, not only in terms of writing and communication with people back home, and being able to tell the story of China as I saw it, but also to begin to make sense of the world that I was living in now. It was a brand new kind of soup to swim in. So it was having those tools to analyze a culture and do that compassionately with a human touch, which all of those things I learned to do at Bethel has really allowed me to flourish. You think you know the answer, you don't. I think if I could tell my 18-year-old self, I think I would say, work harder, talk less, be patient, and keep examining what's in front of you, and something will come clear. It probably will not be the thing you thought. But yeah, I would say that being patient and learning how to listen, whether that's learning how to listen to a source as you're reading or writing, or learning how to listen to a person as they're telling a story, that's the greatest skill you can build.
The Master of Arts in Teaching consists of several licensure paths that someone with an undergraduate degree can take. What it does is it allows someone who might be interested in teaching grades 5-12 social studies the opportunity to earn a teaching licensure in that licensure area, as well as earn a master's degree. A grades 5-12 teaching license in social studies allows teachers to teach all sorts of subjects such as world history, U.S. history, geography, sociology, psychology, economics. It gives you the opportunity to combine your passion for history and social studies and political science and with love of teaching, and really give middle and high school students that spark of why we should care about history and civics. These aren't just things that happened 200, 300, 400 years ago, but these are important concepts that teachers can help bring alive to students so they know they can figure out how to relate the history to what's going on in today's world and just how to be a better citizen. It leaves the path open for a history major to not only thinking about being a teacher, but pursue a career in business or higher education or sociology or human services or healthcare or any path that they may want to take. I think that any liberal arts type of degree is going to well prepare an undergrad student for a variety of careers, and teaching might be one of those careers that someone might want to consider.
We're on one of the most famous streets in the country, certainly the most famous street in St. Paul. This is Summit Avenue. It's full of historic old houses like this brownstone, 599 Summit Avenue. In 1918, this became the home of the Fitzgerald family, and it's where F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote what in his lifetime was his most popular novel, This Side of Paradise, his first novel. So the backstory in this. By 1915, Fitzgerald was studying at Princeton University out in New Jersey, but he was not a very good student. And in 1917, when World War I started, it was the perfect opportunity to skip his classes and join the Army. But according to the story, Fitzgerald had this idea that just in case he died in the war, he needed to write a novel. And so he frantically put together a novel, sent it off to the publisher. They didn't accept it, but the editor was encouraging enough that the next year, in 1919, Fitzgerald spent some time revising it into This Side of Paradise. And he did that in this house at the family home. He said that it was a house below the average on a street above the average. And it became very popular. He then married his wife Zelda, and it initiated his fame in the 1920s. He's kind of one of the novelists of the Jazz Age. Okay, let's continue our conversation about history and popular culture. So earlier, I forget which, but one of you alluded to writing, and so I'd like to follow up on that. And not so much historical fiction, but maybe we'll call it popular history.
Sure.
You know, works that are done, you know, there's a degree of research,
Yep.
there's some rigor to it, but it's written to be accessible for a broad audience. I don't know if someone,
entertaining.
I don't know if someone comes to mind immediately in your field or some other field, but you know, at its best, why is it valuable? What does it do? Or is there anything, you know, academic historians can learn from it?
Boy, I am thinking about 2 books. One that I read this summer, but I can't remember the author and I can't remember the title. But it was about the plague.
Really memorable.
It was about the plague in England in a small town, and that's totally outside of my field of study. But I thought it was fascinating, and it was entertaining, and it was upsetting because I could tell she had fictionalized, especially the ending. And so that actually was a really interesting experience for me because I did feel very passionately about something that is outside my normal field of study, and I love the idea of other students, you know, having that experience in a historical context. The other one is The Devil in the White City.
I was going to ask you about Devil
Eric
in the White
Larson.
City. Yep.
It's I think gotten all sorts of prizes, and it was a fascinating book to read.
But it's, I remember there are kind of 2 parts of it. There's the history of this kind of artificial city that's created in Chicago, and then there's the history of the serial killer.
The serial killer. And the guy was really trying to get inside the mind of the serial killer and really think through what a serial killer was thinking. That didn't really resonate for me. No, maybe that's a good thing. But
that's okay.
You know, I liked the history part, but I didn't like the serial killer fictionalized part. So again, I think that's good, actually, that you can feel the tension between the history and the fiction. Even though the fiction might draw you in, I think that tension sort of keeps you engaged and maybe you want, you know, so you write a paper on it for senior seminar. Fabulous.
There you go.
You know?
Yeah. It's, I mean, I think at its best, they're well researched. And that's often because it's someone who actually has an army of assistants out doing the But I'm reading this one right now, and I think it's Scott Anderson, who's a journalist, I think, by training, did a history of World War I in the Middle East called Lawrence in Arabia. And so it's Lawrence, but it's also like 3 or 4 other characters. And you read through the footnotes, and it doesn't use footnote, but I mean, it's impressive multi-archival work going from like this one guy named Yale, whose papers are at Yale, but also German archives, British archives, Australian archives, I think. I mean, it's like 500 pages. This is not a light like, beach read. And yet, it's also clear that he's got the journalist's ability to do kind of thick description, bring characters to life. And so I try to think of it more as like a form. Like, I'm not really a great writer as a storyteller. Like, I think we all think, well, history is storytelling, right? I'm not naturally a good storyteller. And so I do like to learn from novelists, from playwrights, from journalists who, by the nature of what they're doing, are telling a story. And so sometimes you talk to students about how do you develop characters, and how do you follow an arc of a story, and do you have a climax and a denouement? How do you build tension there?
Well, and I'd say a really interesting example of a historian struggling with, do I write history or do I write fiction, was Jill Lepore's Book of Ages, which I think was a National Book Award, if not finalist, if not the prize winner, but it was definitely in the mix.
Benjamin Franklin's sister.
Benjamin Franklin's sister, and she, in either the forward or afterward, talks about how because of the lack of sources, there's basically a period of Jane Franklin's life that's really hard to get at. And so she was really tempted to just scrap the, historical project in favor of a novel, but she decided to end up writing this history. But because she's really well established and a fantastic historian, it's actually like the book, she's talking with the sources as she's telling the story historically. And that was, to me, like a fabulous read, because you could hear her saying, okay, there's an absence here. And from what I've read about her later life, this is how I could, imagine how she would have reacted in this. But it's very straightforward in terms of...
It's acknowledging.
Right, I don't have, sources here, but here's how I'm extrapolating, her life in this period. And I thought that was a fascinating book.
Well, especially as historians tend not to make their process all that transparent.
Yes.
They actually make it almost, memoir, almost a little intellectual autobiography.
And she's someone who writes popularly, too.
Right, writes essays. And,
So she is, she's an example of someone that everybody should read.
Well, and maybe that gets us to a last time. I mean, should historians be going out into popular culture more? Is this something academic historians could do? But whether it's the kind of books they write, that they, like she writes for the New Yorker,
she does.
Some of us blog. I mean, there are other ways to do this. Some of us speak in different venues.
Yeah.
I mean, your sense of the academy, are academic historians doing this enough, too little, too much? Have you done this? Have you straddled those two worlds in your own life?
I don't think I have, but I appreciate it when other people do. I like the discipline of, getting the peer review and all that stuff for, academic publications and books. And obviously Jill Lepore is someone who is a very seasoned historical scholar. But I mean, I really liked the book. I really like the fact that she reaches out to the general public. I think that's a way of inviting the public into the discipline of history. If you speak to the public, I think it's great that people have blogs. I think it's great that people speak to churches. So I think historians should do more of that. And I think we will be asked to do more of that. And that's why it's important to learn how to speak as well as to write, as well as to think.
No, I think the barrier between those two worlds is becoming thinner and thinner. And so I think that it's not dismissive of the academy, but I think that just when I look at the type of work that colleagues do, you're globally engaged in a different type of way, and that also means you're open to critique from different audiences, which I think also brings on its own layer of challenge, both good and bad. But I think that it's something that isn't going to go away. So I think that when you ask the question of should academics be more concerned with this, I think you have to clearly define who your audience is. But at the same time, I think we can't avoid the fact that, again, that barrier between the two is becoming thinner and thinner.
One more Fitzgerald story before we go for this week's webisode. We're going to backtrack in time to 1913. Fitzgerald was home from school for a Christmas vacation. And after maybe a few too many drinks at supper, he and a friend decided that they just had to sing Christmas carols and barged into the middle of a service at St. John the Evangelist Episcopal Church here just off of Summit Avenue in St. Paul. According to the story, Fitzgerald kind of drunkenly sauntered down the aisle while everyone in St. Paul's aristocracy watched him, interrupted the rector, but then turned to him and said, "Don't mind me, Pastor, go on with the sermon," and then walked out. Another great story, and presages the really tragic part of Fitzgerald's life, which is that alcoholism ultimately led to his professional demise and his early death in 1940. But that's all we have time for this week on Past and Presents. We'll be back next time to talk more about what it is that historians do and meet some more people connected to Bethel's history department.
Baby.